December 17, 1944 near Clairvaux, Luxembourg. Snow fell in thick, silent waves over the Ardennes forest, swallowing the sound of boots and engines alike. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the world had turned upside down. American units were scattered, communications severed, and the German counteroffensive was cutting deep into Allied lines. Private First Class Samuel Sam Turner, of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, trudged through the frozen woods with 3 fellow soldiers, all African American, all cold, hungry, and disoriented. Their M1 carbines were nearly frozen solid, their breath hung in the air like smoke. Behind them, the thunder of German 88s rolled through the valley. Turner knew they were surrounded. He also knew surrender meant something different for men like him. When the first German patrol appeared through the trees, gray uniforms ghostly against the snow, the Americans froze. A voice barked in German. Hand hoch. Waffen runter. Hands up. Drop your weapons. They did as ordered. Within seconds, they were surrounded by young Wehrmacht soldiers, rifles trained on them. A lieutenant stepped forward, tall, sharp-featured, maybe 25. His name tag read Lieutenant Heinrich Voss. He looked at the captured men with visible confusion, his gloved hand hovering near his pistol. He muttered under his breath, "Neger Soldaten? Amerikaner." As if the combination defied logic. Turner stared back, silent. The lieutenant's men whispered among themselves, curiosity mixing with disbelief. Everything in their training, their propaganda, told them this was impossible, that such men could not be soldiers, could not fight like equals. But Turner had been educated in Berlin before the war. His father, a jazz musician, had performed across Europe in the 1930s. He spoke German fluently, though he hadn't used it in years. When one of the guards shoved his shoulder and sneered, Turner replied coldly, in perfect German. "Fass mich nichten. Ich kann selber gehen. Don't touch me. I can walk on my own." The entire squad froze. The lieutenant's jaw tightened, his cigarette trembling between his fingers. Du sprichst Deutsch?" he asked, incredulous. Turner nodded once. "Besser als du Englischisch," he said flatly. A ripple of shock ran through the soldiers. One even laughed nervously. The officer's face reddened, not with anger, but with something closer to humiliation. For the first time, the world he'd been taught to believe in began to fracture. They bound the prisoners and marched them toward a farmhouse being used as a command post. But the atmosphere had changed. The guards no longer barked orders. They stared, whispered, and stole glances as though trying to reconcile what they'd just witnessed with everything they thought they knew about race, war, and worth. Inside the farmhouse, Turner's fate and the strange tension between captor and captive was about to take an even more unexpected turn. The farmhouse smelled of diesel, damp wool, and fear. A flickering kerosene lamp cast long shadows across the walls as the captured Americans were pushed inside. Turner's wrists burned where the rope dug into his skin, but his eyes stayed fixed, calm, watchful. A German officer sat at a rough wooden table. His uniform was crisp despite the mud. Major Dieter Reinhardt, an intelligence officer known for efficiency, leafed through papers while a sergeant translated. But when Turner and his men entered, the major didn't look up right away. When he finally did, his brow furrowed. "Was ist das?" he asked, incredulous. "Afrikanische Soldaten? In der US Army?" Lieutenant Voss cleared his throat, visibly uneasy. "Yes, Herr Major. They fought near Clairvaux. One of them speaks fluent German." Reinhardt's eyes snapped to Turner. "Fluent?" Turner stood straighter. Herr Major. Ich bin in Berlin aufgewachsen. Ich kann Ihr Sprach sehr gut." "Yes, Major. I grew up in Berlin. I know your language very well." The room fell silent. Even the sergeant stopped breathing. The major leaned forward slowly, studying him. You were in Berlin? Yes, sir, Turner said in English, his accent shifting effortlessly. My father was a musician. We lived in Kreuzberg. I went to the Goethe school. For the first time, the major's composure faltered. His fingers drummed the table as he processed what he was hearing. The idea of a black man educated in Germany before the war speaking flawless German collided violently with every lie Nazi ideology had built. He switched back to German. And now you fight against us? Turner's reply was steady. I fight against hate, Herr Major. You just happen to wear its uniform. The words hung in the air like smoke. One guard swore under his breath. Another crossed himself. Reinhardt dismissed the others and poured 2 cups of bitter coffee. He slid one across the table toward Turner. Sit, he said curtly. We'll talk. The interrogation turned into something else, not a questioning, but a reckoning. Turner described his pre-war life, the jazz clubs, the laughter, the neighbors who once smiled but later turned away. He told of how his father was forced to flee when the Nuremberg laws came into effect, and how they had returned to America only to find that prejudice wore a different face, not a different uniform. Reinhardt listened in silence, the ticking of his wristwatch the only sound between them. For the first time in years, someone spoke to him not as a superior, not as a German, but as a man. When the guards returned to escort the prisoners to their quarters, Reinhardt stopped them. Kein Misshandlung, he ordered quietly. No mistreatment. The guards hesitated. He repeated, sharper, ich sag die kein. Turner met his gaze before leaving. Neither saluted, but both understood something unspoken. The war had created enemies, but language and truth had reminded them they were human first. Outside, the snow was falling again, soft and endless, erasing the tracks of those who had come before. The next morning dawned gray and bitter. The POWs were held in a small barn behind the farmhouse, its windows frosted, the air thick with the smell of hay and diesel fumes. Guards paced outside, boots crunching on ice. Private Turner sat against the wall, arms wrapped around himself for warmth. Across from him, Corporal Ellis, a young man from Mississippi, muttered, "They keep staring at us like we're ghosts." Turner managed a faint smile. "To them, we are." Just then, the barn door creaked open. Lieutenant Voss entered with 2 guards. "Aufstehen," he barked. The prisoners stood, stiff from the cold. But instead of shouting orders, Voss motioned toward Turner. "You. Come." They led him across the yard to the farmhouse again. Inside, the major was standing by the stove, reading a weather report. He gestured to a chair. "Sit, Private Turner." Turner hesitated, then obeyed. Reinhardt didn't look up from the papers as he spoke. "I listened last night," he said in English, his tone clipped. "To your words. To your story." He turned, eyes narrowing. "Do you expect me to believe it?" Turner met his gaze. "I don't expect anything, Major. But I know truth sounds different from lies even to men like you." The major's lips twitched. He poured 2 cups of coffee, slid one forward. "Your accent is Berlin." "Kreuzberg, yes. I know it. I was stationed near there before the war." Turner nodded slowly. "I remember the cafes. The brass bands on Sunday mornings. You had a good city once." Reinhardt stared into his cup. "Yes," he said quietly. "We did." There was a long pause. Outside, artillery rumbled in the distance, a reminder that the world beyond their small conversation was still tearing itself apart. Then, as if to reclaim control, the major's tone hardened. "You must understand, Private, our people were taught." He stopped, searching for words. "We were taught that your kind were primitive. Subhuman. Incapable of discipline, of intellect, of..." Turner interrupted gently, in German, "von Menschlichkeit." Humanity. The word hit like a shell burst. Reinhardt didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the window. The snow outside was falling heavier now, covering the bodies of burned-out trucks, frozen horses, and men who had believed too much in myths. Turner stood. "Major, I learned your language from people who treated me as an equal once. Jazz musicians, teachers, neighbors. You may have forgotten, but Germany once knew how to listen." The major turned sharply, not in anger, but in shame. "Enough," he said softly. But Turner didn't stop. "You believed lies because they were easier than truth. But look at me. I wear your enemy's uniform, but I am not your enemy. I'm just proof that what you built this war on was wrong." For the first time, the German officer looked smaller, not as a man of power, but as a man undone. Finally, he whispered, "Vielleicht hast du recht. Maybe you're right." Turner nodded once. "Vielleicht." When he was escorted back to the barn, the guards no longer looked at him with contempt. One even handed him a piece of bread silently, avoiding eye contact. It was a small thing, but Turner understood its meaning. Inside, Corporal Ellis asked, "What happened in there?" Turner simply said, "Nothing." But something changed. That night, for the first time since their capture, the guards left the lantern burning inside the barn, a small light against the endless dark. 2 days later, the front had shifted again. The thunder of Allied artillery grew closer, the dull percussion rolling over the hills like an approaching storm. German morale was cracking, and in the small makeshift camp, the mood shifted with it. The guards were quieter now, less certain. They spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the west. Rumors said the Americans were only 10 miles away. Turner sensed it, the subtle unraveling of the German discipline that had once seemed unbreakable. The cold, the hunger, the realization that the Reich was collapsing, all of it hung heavy in the air. That evening, Lieutenant Voss appeared at the barn again. He looked exhausted, his once immaculate uniform streaked with mud. "Rauskomm'n," he ordered, but his voice carried no menace. Turner and the others stepped into the pale moonlight. Voss dismissed the guards and approached Turner directly. "Ich muss etwas wissen," he said quietly. "I need to know something." Turner frowned. "What's that?" "Why?" The lieutenant's eyes were tired, almost pleading. "Why do you fight for a country that treats you like," he searched for the word, "unser Propaganda hat gesagt, weniger als Menschen." "Our propaganda said, less than men." Turner hesitated. The question cut deeper than Voss knew. Then he replied, his breath visible in the cold. "Because it's my country too. Because if I don't fight, they'll never see me as anything more." The German's eyes dropped. He nodded slowly, as though the words weighed more than he expected. "Das ist Mut," he said, "that is courage." Before he turned to leave, Voss muttered something almost to himself. "Vielleicht verdienen wir, sie verlieren." Maybe we deserve to lose. That night, Turner lay awake, staring at the rafters. He could hear artillery fire in the distance, closer now, rhythmic, unstoppable. And for the first time since his capture, he felt a strange sense of peace. At dawn, chaos erupted. The guards shouted, boots thundering outside as an explosion rattled the barn. One wall buckled under the impact. Through the smoke, Turner saw German soldiers running, abandoning their posts. The American 11th Armored Division had broken through. Turner and his men pushed against the half-collapsed door, splintering it open. As they stumbled into the open air, tracer fire streaked across the horizon. German vehicles burned along the ridge. A lone figure emerged through the haze, Lieutenant Voss, weapon discarded, hands raised. His eyes met Turner's across the wreckage. For a long second, neither moved. Then Turner shouted to the approaching Sherman tank, waving a piece of cloth. "Hold your fire. POWs here." When the Americans arrived, they didn't know what to make of the scene: black soldiers standing beside surrendering Germans. But Turner didn't explain. Some truths didn't fit neatly into after-action reports. As he was escorted back toward the Allied lines, Turner glanced back once more. Voss stood beside the burning farmhouse, head bowed, smoke curling around him. The two men, enemies by uniform, connected by understanding, exchanged a final nod. In the roar of liberation, it was almost lost. But for both of them, that silent gesture said everything. March 1945. Weeks later. The Ardennes thawed, rivers swelled with melted snow, and Europe began to breathe again. For Private Samuel Turner, freedom came not with cheering crowds, but with quiet disbelief. He and the other liberated POWs were trucked to a rear area field hospital, their uniforms ragged, their faces thin but alive. Doctors ran their tests, clerks took statements, and the endless paperwork of war began. Yet when Turner tried to describe what had happened, the German officer who had spoken to him as an equal, the disbelief when he'd spoken fluent German, few seemed to listen. One sergeant laughed. "Hell of a story, Private. You tellin' me a Kraut gave you coffee?" Turner said nothing. Some things were too fragile for ridicule. He was reassigned to a replacement depot near Liege, processing German POWs. When he walked the rows of captured men, he saw hundreds who looked hollowed out, not from hunger, but from the collapse of everything they'd believed. Every now and then, he would spot a familiar uniform color, a familiar insignia, and wonder, was Voss among them? No one could tell him. One afternoon, while distributing rations to a new batch of captives, a gray-coated soldier approached hesitantly. He was young, barely 20. In his trembling hand, he held a folded scrap of paper. "For Sie," he said quietly, "for you." Turner unfolded it. Inside was a sketch, rough pencil lines on thin field paper, of a man standing in the snow, hands unbound, speaking to another across a table. At the bottom, in small letters: "Danke, das Sie mir gezeigt haben, das wir alle Menschen sind." Thank you for showing me that we are all human. There was no name. But Turner knew. He folded the paper carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, close to his heart. Years later, long after the war ended, that same scrap would sit framed on a shelf in his small Detroit apartment. Visitors often asked what it meant. Turner would just smile faintly and say, "It's from the war, from someone who forgot how to hate." The story never made the history books. It wasn't written in after-action reports or unit records. But in a war defined by inhumanity, a single conversation in a frozen farmhouse had done something no army could. It had made two men, enemies by duty, see each other clearly for the first time. And though the world moved on, that truth spoken in fluent German by an American soldier whose humanity could not be denied lingered like a whisper across the ruins of Europe.